Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together. All right, real quick before we get started on the show, I'm just going to talk about Treeline Academy. You've heard me say it. I can't even tell you how many times. Mark Livesay is treelineacademy.net. That's treelineacademy.net. Sign up. Use the promo code PC2020. Save yourself $20. Can't say it enough. It's awesome, amazing, most comprehensive e-scouting course out there. Check it out for yourself. Sign up. Use promo code PC2020. And now let's get to the show.
Okay, so I'm sitting here and I am talking to Michael Judd. And Michael, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for everybody listening?
Sure. Michael Judd here. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Maryland. We grow a cornucopia of fruits and nuts and work with permaculture design, focusing largely on perennial food systems, sometimes referred to as tree crops. I also focus on creating agroforestry designs on larger landscapes with a real focus on nut trees. Now, my journey as an adult, I've lived 20 years in rural Latin America. I lived in some of the far-flung corners where there were no stores, where, really what you grew is what you ate, was something that I experienced deeply and has opened my eyes and understanding around food security. And now I've come back to living in the States in a very populous area, the Mid-Atlantic here. I've just translated a lot of that food security into what's going on around us here. And that's a lot of what drives me toward planting nut trees and, sort of diversifying, the food source, and also proving how it can be, economically viable so that it really catches fire and people really start wanting to plant trees because it makes money and because it creates nutrient-dense food and food security. And we can go into that because that relates to, the nuts are feeding wildlife and, are another part of being able to live in the North is really based around nut trees.
So I got to ask you a few things first. One, can you define permaculture for everybody that's listening out there so they can get a greater understanding, and maybe even I'll get a better understanding of what actually permaculture is?
Yeah, permaculture is a holistic design that was developed in the late 70s down in Australia by Tasmanian men, Bill Mollison and David Holgram. And it is based on observation. So you observe your environment, your ecosystem, you see how things are flowing and working together. And you take those observations, and when you begin to design your habitat for food, for shelter, for economic needs, even social needs, you start to design everything as a whole instead of, separate. I would say a lot of times in modern culture, we separate and specialize things. It's organic gardening, and then it's forestry, and then it's, natural building. Whereas, permaculture takes all these together, and as you're designing one aspect, you're thinking about its relation to the other and to another. And there's kind of a general rule of thumb that, any aspect of your design should have at least 3 relationships. So if you're going to, put your garden in a certain location, what's its relationship to your compost? What's its relationship to your animals? What's its relationship to the flow around your house? So I think it's a wonderful design to learn because it has no ceiling. It has no set hard definitions, so that you learn to adapt it to your site, wherever that is. And it can pretty much be applied to anywhere on the planet. So yeah, that's kind of the nutshell of permaculture. A lot of it's just observation and then designing, in those patterns of nature, but with our modern realities, with economies in mind, with modern comforts and, all these different realities we have now, but using successful natural patterns to design.
Yeah. No, that's a great explanation of it that I haven't quite heard in such detail before, which is it's kind of nice because it gives a better picture, and I'm sure a lot of listeners as well, myself, fully didn't have an understanding of it before, but designing it, in the ways that you put it, definitely help with that. So I'm kind of curious. Before we get into how you and I were talking about nut trees and all that kind of stuff and how it applies to wildlife and hunting and designing landscapes for hunting and things like that, one of the things I wanted to talk about is pawpaws and like geographically speaking, where they were located, where they pretty much can be found now, and if you wanted to kind of spread them out and actually start planting them, where would be good locations to kind of start growing them? Because pretty much anymore around me, the only people who have pawpaws, I'm in the northern portion of Illinois, and which once was, native everywhere, probably throughout Illinois, is no longer existent other than pretty much in the south.
Mm. So the pawpaw is an extremely unique species. It is basically a tropical fruit that migrated north, over millions of years. From what we call modern day, northern Mexico, that region began coming north on receding glaciers and, the guts of giant, sloths and mastodons, and just adapted all the way up into what we call today, Southern Ontario in Canada, which is remarkable. I mean, there's nothing else like it in the landscape. There's no other tropical species that is thriving and living here in the cold north, through the winters and being, super productive in the right conditions. So we are talking about a very adaptive species that can grow in full shade, in the dense canopy of the forest, but not produce fruit in those circumstances. It can grow on the edge of the forest where it gets partial light, and then it can grow in full sun. And its range is, historically, there's about 26 states, that it's found in, but it's pushing those limits because we're talking about a very adaptive species. It's really impressive and really fun to work with because of that. And so it's spreading out. Europe, there's quite a renaissance and a lot of growing in Europe. South Korea has planted, more than 1 million of these trees, partly for their medicinal value as well. So they have a very strong medicinal compound. It's been called acetogenin. That's in the twigs and the leaves. It's being used for research and application in relation to cancer and other disease issues. And then in the US, it grows roughly between USDA zones 5, 6, going down into zone 9. And on the northern edge, which is maybe what you're talking about there, Luke, is the fact that it needs a long enough summer to ripen its fruits. So the trees themselves will grow into zone 4, but you need that sort of long, warm summer to get that fruit to ripen. And that tends to happen more starting at about zone 5B, 6, and then of course, 7, 8 are on the sweet spot. And then you start getting down south, sort of southern Georgia is where they stop really being successful. But that said, people are trying and growing out seedlings, and those seedlings are adapting genetically to their environment, and they can keep migrating. As humans, that's one of the great things we can do is help plants migrate. We can help propagate. We can sort of interject our touch into the genome of the plant world. And the pawpaw is very, very ready to interact with us and move. So I wouldn't be surprised to see it going into new territories The north, I know it's being grown in the Northwest some, Northern California, Oregon, Washington State. Again, part of the challenge is making sure that they get a warm, summer to ripen that fruit. So certain genetics there of the pawpaw would be shorter season pawpaws, ones that have been noted to fruit, quicker than others. So again, it's getting to know maybe what pawpaws are closest to your region, and then start working with some of the seedlings. In the grafted, cultivar world of pawpaws, there are certain ones that have been developed in cooler climates, cloudier climates, et cetera, et cetera. I wrote a whole book on pawpaws called For the Love of Pawpaws. And in there, I certainly get into many of the cultivars and some of these nuances of the pawpaw. But I'll stop there and see what you're curious about. I could go on forever.
So yeah, no, I find it just super interesting. I'm just sitting here in awe and listening, as we're talking about this, because it's so fascinating. I have a friend that actually, I think he has like 2 pawpaw trees in his yard that he actually planted. I'm not sure where he got them or where they're from, but they actually do rather well, and they produce almost every year they produce a decent amount of pawpaws, which I found really fascinating. And that was my first kind of introduction into pawpaws, and eating one for the first time, and knowing that Lewis and Clark and other people on expeditions and whatnot actually ate the same fruit. It was just kind of fascinating to me that they've been around so long and thrived.
Yeah, they so if you have some of these more selected genetics, it's kind of like comparing a wild apple tree, crab apple, to like a golden delicious. You got a big spectrum of genetics to choose from, and same with the pawpaw. Sometimes you'll find pawpaws in the wild that are small, the size of kind of like a fingerling potato, and it'll have large lima bean sized seeds in it, so it won't have very much flesh. And then that flesh could be, bitter and tannic, versus ones that have been selected, by humans over time. You're talking about large fruits, sometimes, upwards of 2 pounds. So the size of a large mango. And in there will be just a few seeds and lots of pulp, and that pulp will be sweet. It have a nice custard-like texture to it. It'll have aromatic notes of mango, banana, pineapple, and will be one of the most exquisite fruits you will ever eat. So that's one of the reasons we have a pawpaw festival every September here when we have our main harvest, is to get people off on the right experience with the pawpaw, in not only the genetics, but making sure that it's picked at the right time and sort of handled properly and eaten, in its prime state. Because the pawpaw is not well known these days because it doesn't fit into our modern, food system, transportation system, because they are very perishable. So, once they've ripened, you maybe have 2, 3, 4 days, at room temperature to eat them. You can refrigerate them for at least a week or so. And then the real saving grace is that you can pulp them and freeze it well for a year or more, and then just use it as you need it. And if you have a tree with good genetics, you're growing it in full sun, and it's got wind protection and adequate moisture, you could be looking at 35 plus pounds of fruit off of a tree every year.
Yeah, I don't think I know my buddy doesn't get that much fruit off of his, mostly because he says it's a battle between him and the squirrels and some of the other critters out there to try and see who can get the most consumed first.
Well, tell them to plant more. That's the trick. That's always the trick. Plant enough for yourself, the animals, the feral hippies, everybody, so that there's just plenty, and it's not an issue of running out,
Yeah.
if possible. plant more.
That's like when you were talking about the apples and a crab apple or a feral type of apple versus like Golden Delicious or whatever. I just recently, like a year ago, found out that all apples that are a certain variety are clones, in the store, and the started digging in detail on all that, and it's just fascinating to think that at one point in time there was so many different varieties available because of your local cultivars that people had and things like that, versus now where it's all commercialized is pretty interesting.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother thing to explore. And like it's like bananas. Pretty much 90% of the bananas that everyone's eating in the world is one clone. It's one variety, and issues with that are starting to show up. And I think we'll see more of this as we go into the future. It's kind of inevitable. As we've been focusing the genetics in a limited way, and then it becomes issues with that, but our food system has become reliant on that, then it's going to start scrambling things, which I think is needed, and bring us back more to understanding the importance of diversity and how healthy that can be.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect segue, how you just worded that, to transition into that then and talk about, having independent food sources that are maybe native or local, and how they can coexist with each other and the animals, and how you can bring those in. So can we talk about that a little bit then?
Yeah. I think nutrient density is really important. A lot of the foods that we're eating these days are not high in nutrient. And that's partly because of the narrow genetics that have been focused on. A lot of times the foods, like say a lot, are focused for shipping, and not necessarily other characteristics. And then the soils they're grown in are typically depleted. So a lot of the foods we're eating don't have high nutrient density in them. And that's a factor for health and just, many, many things. So growing food, and that's one of the reasons I like to focus on perennial foods. Typically, perennial foods have much higher nutrient density in them. They're coming from trees, they're coming from woody shrubs, they're coming from established perennials that have deep roots, that are pulling up minerals from the subsoil, that are holding and creating a richer soil around themselves, have more networks of fungi and nutrients. And that's all coming up into the food, the nuts and the fruits and the berries and, the fodder and things that you might be eating from those perennials are feeding your body much more deeply than the intensive annual agriculture that our diet has become. So there's a couple layers here. There's basic food access and food security, and growing your own, but then there's just the nutrient density and the importance of having that, in our diets. But they come together when you start to work with your own food systems, and the whole idea of self-sufficiency is really never been the case. For humans, we've traditionally focused on what grew well in our area or our site, and then we would trade with others in another region that grew something else better or well. So, it's not that you have to start, being totally self-sufficient. I think it's important that we keep working as extended community and trade and support. So don't necessarily feel like you've got to go out and grow all your own food, but focus on what does well for you. Our site here, we got about 25 acres, in mostly woods with a creek that runs through it, about 3 acres of open area and kind of a low riparian, an Appalachian holler. And certain things grow really well here. Persimmons grow really well here because of that wetter soil. Mulberries grow really well here. Pecans and certain hickories grow really well here. Where there's drainage, pawpaws grow really well here. Same with, hybrid chestnuts. So it's like, okay, well, those grow really well here. Let's focus on those, and let's work with that, versus saying, oh, well, maybe we should, plow up a big field here and try and grow pumpkins or something. It's just not what this site is really sort of, offering naturally. So I think it's really important to go with what your site offers naturally. And that means a lot less work for you as well. and this comes back to permaculture and observing what's flowing, what's naturally abundant. And when you interact with what's naturally abundant, things are exponential. So you put your human touch into that flow and you get a huge response. You get, a huge harvest from it without a lot of input. So a good example of that for us are mushrooms, right? So the mid-Atlantic, lots of humidity, lots of good rainfall, lots of tree and organic matter everywhere. So the mushrooms are crazy. You see them everywhere all the time. So it's like, okay, well, I'm seeing mushrooms everywhere. Why don't I start just, inoculating some logs with shiitake and oyster? Why don't I start inoculating the wood chips everywhere with wine cap mushrooms? And I just do this one little thing one time, and then I just get this perennial return because all that energy and the conditions are here. Same with the pawpaw. Pawpaw is growing wild all around us, mostly in the woods. But it's like, okay, well, how about I, get some select genetics of that pawpaw and I put it out in full sun and I give it tons of mulch so it has what it needs, and then it's super productive and I didn't have to do much. Versus, trying to, come up with an idea that might be more exotic or not really presenting itself, flourishing where we're at and putting tons of energy and input to get that thing to work. It's just using a lot of energy and you don't need to.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So there's so many things there that you just touched on that I kind of want to go into detail more. Like how do you inoculate, say your wood chips or inoculate wood to grow oyster mushrooms or things like that? Where do you get the original mycelium or spores, or how do you do that?
It's actually really easy. Mostly work with hardwoods. So in our area, we have a lot of tulip poplar and we have oak. And the easiest mushrooms to grow are the ones I mentioned. Shiitake are super easy to grow on logs. They love oak, really, and hard maples. And then oyster mushrooms, also very easy to grow on logs. Also, you can grow those on straw bales and other mediums, but I only do logs. It's less work, less input. And they grow well on tulip poplars and willows. So one of my favorite resources for all things fungi is Field and Forest Products. They're out in Wisconsin. They're great folks, and their website and their catalog is very how-to for the beginner. And also in my first book, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist, which is a how-to book on many of the subjects that I'm talking about. One chapter is how to grow mushrooms, on logs and wood chips. And very, very picture rich and very how-to oriented. The books I've written are all things that I've been involved in and things that I've done, and I make it very approachable for people to just get their mind wrapped around and realize the basic steps to go ahead and do these things. So what you want for mushrooms is healthy wood. So ideally cut when it's dormant. So that's either late winter or now for us here in November when the trees go dormant again. We look for trees that might need to be thinned, smaller diameter. We're talking 4 to 8 inches approximately in diameter. So a lot of times in the forestry growth, we get a jumble of trees. So going through and thinning those out sometimes is helpful to sort of speed up succession in the woods, but then also gives us, perfect mushroom wood. Branch wood is really good. So a lot of times people are taking down trees in your area, beautiful trees that are healthy. Don't ask me why people need to cut down trees all the time, but they are. So it's like, okay, well what you want is that branch wood. The branch wood has a lot of sap in it, sap wood, I should say. The sort of, it's almost like white bread for the fungi. They eat it up versus some of that harder heartwood that you might find in the core trunk of the tree. So younger trees are full of sapwood. Branches are full of sapwood. You can use wood that has some heartwood in it, but make sure it's got enough sapwood for the fungi to really get started. And then it's just a matter of drilling. You drill your log, about every 6 inches, rotate it over 4 inches. Keep doing that pattern every 6 inches around your log. So a log is usually 30, 36 inches long. You might use 25, 30 plugs. You get these little wooden dowels or sawdust that are inoculated with certain types of shiitake or oyster. And you just, you infill those drilled holes, you seal them with wax, and you put your log, in a place that stays moist, and give it time. And usually about a year, it'll start popping mushrooms, twice a year for many years. So it's just one little input of time, and you have the right conditions, it just flourishes for you. And it's a great way to be productive in the shade. And these logs can be very productive. You can easily get a pound, a year off of each log. And that's a lot when it comes to mushrooms. And you get multiple logs going, and it's just amazing how productive they can be without much input, in the right conditions. And you can, even in suburbia and many places, you can retrofit this growing mushrooms. I read an article about two guys that lived in suburbia at a 1/4 acre lot, and they set up shade cloth in their little duplex in the back of their yard, and went and got logs from somewhere nearby, or you could get talk to someone who cuts for firewood and tell them exactly what you want. You don't have to have woods or logs or even know how to use a chainsaw. You can coordinate getting these materials to you. And they set it up, and I think they grew 4,000 logs in their little backyard, and made over $80,000. So it's variable. It's actually, yeah, it's one of the most lucrative legal crops that you can work with. Pawpaws too. The pawpaws are selling for easy $10 a pound.
Wow.
That's like 2 pawpaws. Remember, a tree can do 35 pounds. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. I don't know how long that's going to last, but it's pretty phenomenal. Return. And it's important to look for these sort of niche markets if you really are thinking about growing something to sell, to make to live on. Because as most people who've done market gardening, realize that it's a lot of hard work, and you really don't make much money. But if you get sort of niche creative, and you work with perennials, you put a little bit of investment of time up front, then you can really actually do quite well with a lot less work.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I mean, you've got your kids doing it with the inoculating the logs and doing the mushrooms and stuff. I mean, that's a pretty neat family project as well, to try and do that and get everybody involved, and then reap the reward in the end. It's probably pretty good feeling to do that.
It is. It's fun. The kids do love it. And it's kind of a good community thing to get people around. It kind of has that collective energy to get more logs, or, get things done, gather more people. Everyone loves it, man. They come out and we do mushroom workshops, or just, volunteer day, and we do mushrooms. People just get excited. And remember, if you are cutting the trees, you can inoculate the stumps. The stumps actually can produce for 10 or more years, because they have that network of wood and root in the ground, and it has a nice balance of moisture because it's in the ground. So the stumps are, and you've probably seen stumps, old stumps sprouting mushrooms in parking lots, or, who knows where, long after they were cut. So if you get a chance, definitely inoculate the stumps.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I cut down a old black walnut tree on my property, my property is riddled with black walnuts. And this year we had such an abundance of walnuts. It almost got to the point to where I really didn't know what to do, or even how to process them anymore, because it came in such abundance this year and then I showed you some pictures and stuff of how I came up with to do it, because it was too much to process with my old methods. But I cut down this walnut tree because it was dead growth, and I didn't want it falling on the driveway and crushing a bunch of cars. That'd be terrible. So when I cut it down, I actually had a friend's dad come over with a stump grinder and grind the stump. But underneath, for about 4 or 5 years, I had morels. I think it was about 5 years I had morels growing in that spot after I cut it down.
Wow.
About a year after. And I never saw that relationship before. And I still, in the wild, sometimes look around, dead growth walnut trees, but haven't found any morels other than that spot. And I'm wondering if it might have been that I brought my morel bag or something and accidentally inoculated that one area as it was being ground or something. but pretty cool.
Could be. You can actually put, if you like for your chainsaw oil, you can use, whatever kind of oil. You can use cooking oil, and you can inoculate your cooking oil with spores of, say, oyster. And when you're out there and you're working in the forest full of tulip poplar, and you're cutting, you're just throwing the spores everywhere while you're cutting. And that's a really cool, way to add certain types of mushrooms into your ecosystem. I know that Paul Stamets, who's really the guru of all things fungi, and his outfit's called Fungi Perfecti, and they're great. Also, wonderful resource, both for all things to grow mushrooms, but just to learn the deeper relationship that we have with fungi. And if you have 18 minutes, I highly recommend listening to Paul Stamets' TED Talk. I think it's called 7 Ways Mushrooms Can Save the World. And it'll blow you away to realize how interlinked we are as a species and as a planet with fungi, and different ways to work with fungi. As we move forward into the 6th extinction of the planet, we're in an extinction period, and it's like, well, what species can we pair with to successfully make it through? And when you look back in historical records of past extinctions, the majority of those few species that made it through were the ones that paired with fungi. And it's like, okay, here we are again. We're going to an extension, and fungi are the ally, one of the main allies. And I think the nut trees are too, and certain ones within the nut trees have really even shown themselves in recent times to be very supportive of the human species. The chestnut. And during World War II, many parts of Italy and France were cut off. And those areas already had a culture of growing and working with chestnuts, which are annual bearers, which is really important. So they annually bear copious amounts of nuts that are high in carbohydrates and very low in oil, which means they store very well, either as a dried nut or as a flour, and then can be eaten in many different creative, tasty ways. And many of those isolated communities literally pulled through and survived because of the chestnut. And there's many stories of the chestnut supporting, humans during good and stressful times. And we're kind of in that mix now. We're in good and stressful times, and I think working with the chestnut, in our case, the hybrid chestnut, and what's proving to work really well as far as health of tree, productivity, quality of nuts, is the Chinese chestnut. It's Mollissima. So there's different types of chestnuts across the world. There's the American chestnut, which is not currently being productive. There's the European chestnut, which has quite a few disease issues for many parts of the country, certainly the Mid-Atlantic. And then there's a couple different Asian chestnuts. There's a Korean chestnut, there's a Japanese chestnut, and there's a Chinese chestnut. And these are all kind of distinct species. And what's really being proven in many parts of the US right now is the Chinese chestnut is thriving. It is very resistant to the fungal issues that are keeping the American chestnut from being productive. They're fast growing, they're tough, and they're annual producers, of up to 100 pounds per tree of a very nutrient dense, carbohydrate rich nut. Basically it's a grain tree. It's bread tree. It's a perennial food source that feeds not only humans but the entire ecosystem. All the animals are showing up there. All the macrofauna are showing up and eating that, and then that's trickling down through the system. So they're pretty much a keystone species. The nut trees in the north are keystone, and that's an ecological term that we use based on an arch, like a stone arch. That center stone is called the keystone, and that's what holds it all together. And fungi are a keystone species for our existence. And I'm gonna also say that nut trees are a keystone in our temperate forest ecosystems, and that they support the network of wildlife and traditionally humans. When you look at indigenous ways of working with the land and being with the land along this whole eastern seaboard was in selection of nuts, selecting the nut trees that were highly productive, good genetics, and then a lot of burning was done in the understory to clear, so that as the wildlife came and eat the nuts, they could do the hunting. So they gathered and ate the nuts, stored the nuts, but then they also relied on the wildlife that ate the nuts to get through the winters and through the cold times here. So again, just the nuts are extremely important. And right now, the grocery stores are open, everything is flowing. Very grateful for that. But in planning for reduction in certain availability of food, and again, even if it's not just in quantity and quality, I'm sure the planet's going to keep pumping out low grade grains, as we go into the future. But is that really feeding us? And where's it coming from? And there's just there's more issues with transportation, whereas the nuts we can grow here, they're high nutrient density, they store well. We can feed the animals with them, even if it's domestic animals. Your chestnut is a great feed for your domesticated animals. You can store it and feed your animals it over the winter as well. So I think there's a lot of applicability for nut trees, both economically and ecologically, and just basic survival.
Yeah. So I got to ask you though, is the Chinese chestnut a smaller chestnut than the American chestnut?
It's a smaller tree, so it's been worked with for thousands of years, by a culture that understands its value and understands the value of working with perennials. Whereas, the more contemporary, culture in the U.S. has been very annual oriented in its diet and its use of the land, and has not necessarily done the work that these other cultures have with tree crops. So, the Chinese and other these cultures that have tradition of working with really intimately with their ecosystems have worked with developing some great genetics. And their trees are only about 30 or 40 feet tall, umbrella shaped, which really maximizes, access to sun and access, to actually being able to harvest and not overwhelm and shade each other out at high reaches. So yeah, so they are smaller, but they produce large nuts. A lot of the sort of the storybook chestnuts that we think about, that's really what you're getting from the Chinese chestnuts, and they're very tasty. I did a blind taste test once early on in my adventures with chestnuts, where I wasn't really already familiar with the flavors of the different types of chestnuts. So I did a blind chestnut tasting of American, European, Chinese, and Japanese. And out of those, the American actually was very tasty. The American chestnuts, it's small. It can be like a small acorn size, but very tasty, very sweet. And then the Chinese chestnut was also delicious, very sweet, very crisp. And the European and the Japanese were still good, but just didn't quite have that same sweet crispness, for at least in the example that I had. So anyway, it's the Chinese chestnut's one of the best tasting chestnuts. It's one of the most productive chestnuts. The tree is very tough. Once you get it established, it's very drought tolerant. It'll grow on less than ideal soils. It just needs drainage. It does not like a high pH though. So, if you have a high pH soil, it may not be best suited for the chestnuts, but historically they're grown on really steep hillsides. If you look at these places like in Corsica and other places in Europe, a lot of times they're grown on the marginal hillsides, and the lowlands are, saved for the grains and whatnot. And that's also a traditional wise use of land. When things are sloped, put perennials on it. Otherwise, you're largely losing your soil and your runoff on anything that's got a slope, that doesn't have trees or some kind of woody perennials on it. Typically is going to lose its value. And cultures that work intimately with their ecosystems for generations, recognize the value of doing your woody perennials on slopes, and then use your lowlands for your annuals, and maybe your livestock.
Interesting. So if someone was interested in trying to grow chestnuts on their property or something like that, where would they go and try and purchase a chestnut tree or a Chinese chestnut?
So I'll give a pitch for a nonprofit that I started a couple of years ago based on nut trees, and specifically the productive chestnut trees. And that is Silvo Culture. Silvoculture.org is a great place to start just to land and start to learn about these types of nuts that we're talking about. And there's links and resources to more from our site. The University of Missouri has an agroforestry program that has done a lot of work and research with the Chinese chestnut. They're a great resource as well. They have some really good papers, PDFs that can give you a lot of understanding. Silvo Culture does as well. I think even on your landing page, you can read, sort of an extended brochure that answers a lot of general questions very quickly. And, from there, it depends where you're at in the country. The Northwest, U.S. Northwest, has its own sort of culture for growing nuts, and they can get away with growing some of the European chestnuts more. Though I don't know for how long. I know the Chinese chestnut's probably doing well in those regions as well. Route 9 Cooperative is in Ohio, and a great resource for trees and culinary nuts and seed nuts. University of Missouri also has a limited amount of nuts you can order, and they have some of the best genetics. And then for seed nuts, Route 9 Cooperative is another good source. And then as you go down to the sort of the southeast area, there's the Dunstan chestnut. So a Dunstan chestnut has been a very successful marketing campaign on what looks like largely a Chinese type chestnut, but is marketed as an American Chinese hybrid. And it seems to be doing quite well in the southeast region. So Dunstan chestnuts would be something that you might find in that area. Each area and region, might start already having of its own sort of, chestnut culture going. And we're going to hear more and more about this because already, more and more orchards are coming online because they're proving themselves to be economically viable as well. So there's quite good income to be made by planting chestnuts and doing chestnut orcharding, and it's proving itself. So a lot more people are getting on board with it. So in years to come, we're going to hear a lot more about chestnuts in our country because we're also importing 88% of the chestnuts that we consume. 88%. And yeah. So I mean, just from supply demand right there, it's like, whoa, there's a great market opportunity here, and the nuts we grow are going to be of better quality, partly because we don't have to ship them, and the nuts that are shipped from Europe and other places do not arrive. They're not handled well, and typically the quality is lost. Whereas grow them in country, direct access to the markets, you get high quality nuts, and there's just a high demand for them. Yeah. Already. So yeah.
Not to mention supply chain shortages and shipping delays and everything else that we're seeing and experiencing nowadays, kind of how you were talking about earlier. I mean, you're not feeling the pain that you could be feeling yet, but it's a definite possibility. And why not, like you said, have those local resources available and in abundance to where you and the wildlife can enjoy them, right?
Yeah, and so yeah, just basic preparedness, no doom and gloom here, but basic preparedness. Basic being prepared is wise. But then also the actions that we can take right now with our resources and our knowledge to plant nut trees will be here for hundreds of years. These trees live for hundreds of years. There's some chestnuts that live over 1,000 years. and they stay productive and pumping nuts. So it's like, well, what's valuable with who we are, where we are, and what we have right now? To me, it comes down to planting nut trees, and that's going to feed life, for a long, long time. And that just also gives my life value and what I focus on, a lot of meaning. And that can, that can go for all of us. We can find ways to help supporting nut trees, and every nut tree you plant will be quite a legacy.
So I got to ask you though, like other than the chestnut, I mean, is there any other one that kind of like stands out that is a definite producer that's something that's super valuable as far as resources?
Yes, absolutely. There's quite a few. You mentioned earlier the black walnut. So the black walnut, especially in our region, I mean, the U.S., I mean, what we call the U.S., this continent, I think has like it's sort of the originator of that family. And there's the most of that species on this continent. They do really well here. Now, black walnuts, like that wild crab apple or wild pawpaw, there's a big variety in quality. So a lot of the just wild black walnuts like that we have around here are thick shelled. And when you open them, there's a lot of different compartments, and the nuts are really kind of tricky to get out. And it ends up being these little pieces and a lot of work. Whereas the select genetics in walnuts are, large, thinner shelled, and they have larger compartments where you could pop out, more easily what we're used to seeing, as sort of a walnut, which are usually European walnuts, you know, come out as these nice full halves. So I think working with the black walnut in a lot of areas is really worthwhile. But again, taking the effort to get good genetics, and with black walnuts, a lot of times seeds can bring. So if you're getting seeds from an orchard that's all, got grafted cultivars and has good genetics, generally speaking, planting a black walnut seed with good genetics will give you a tree with good genetics. Of course, you can always graft them, and grafting does give you even more assurance of having high quality. But yeah, I would say the black walnut, and the black walnut, not only for its eating quality, but you can also press oil out of black walnuts. So it's got a high, a decent oil content. So we think in terms of your sort of your bread and your butter. And when it comes to trees, your bread trees are your chestnut, maybe your white acorns, these are your carbohydrate rich, food source. And then your butter, your oil trees are things like your bitternut hickory, which has a very high oil content, a thin shell, and it presses oil quite easily and readily. And so do hazelnuts. So hazelnuts have a high oil content and can be pressed quite easily, to create, your oil reserves, your nutrient rich oil. So I think thinking in those terms is helpful, in that you have a diversity for your diet and for marketing. Trying to think of what else. So a pecan is a hickory. It's a thin-shelled hickory, and there are really great northern pecans. So, if you're in the north, look for good genetics of northern pecans. They do exist. Don't necessarily buy a pecan from the south and plant it. Look for what is known as good northern pecans. And you need to plant, a handful of them for good cross-pollination. And then again, grafting them is a great idea to get exactly, what you're hoping for. I'm actually sitting here right now with a shellbark hickory that is a solid 2 inches by 2 inches. I mean, it's just huge for a hickory nut. This is a grafted cultivar. So it does make sense to get the good genetics with anything you're going to plant. If you're going to take the effort and the time to plant something to get it established, then I encourage you to get the best genetics. Not necessarily. So a lot of people will get free trees, right? They'll get free trees from an organization. They're like, oh, great, it's a free tree, and they plant it and they care for it and they put, they give valuable space to it. Without really thinking that really that free part was not really the most valuable part. I encourage people moreover to think about really maybe putting some little bit of money toward buying good genetics, from a good nursery that has, the same tree, but you're going to get a lot more out of it as far as the food goes. Really, the time and the input and the care of your tree is the value. So you might as well, make sure you've got some of the best genetics to start with. And a couple of great nurseries. Grimo Nut Nursery is a great nursery. They're actually just in Ontario, so they're in Canada, but they ship to the U.S. They have a lot of good select genetics. England's Orchard, he's down in Kentucky, I want to say, and he's got some good genetics for the black walnuts and others. Plant Path Nursery are friends of mine. They're here in Maryland. They have a lot of good genetics. They have a lot of those good hybrid Chinese chestnuts I was telling you about. So Plant Path Nursery is a good one. And then, just paying attention to the nurseries and what they're actually really saying about the genetics. Because if they have good genetics, they're going to talk about it. They're going to say they have it. And it's good to question and ask, up front, what is the source of these plants? And if someone really can't tell you, then I would move along until, you can get some clarity. And that goes for fruit trees too. If it's persimmons, get some of the select persimmons. If it's aronia berries, get some of the select aronia berries, versus, a nursery that might just be selling wild stock, wild pawpaws. I wouldn't, unless you wanted it for rootstock. I would look for, stuff that, people who have taken the time to really focus on the stuff of good quality.
Yeah, no, that's great. Great advice. So I got to ask you, what is an aronia berry? I've never even heard of that. So now you just
well, I'm just remembering too. I have a small nursery myself. I should make a small pitch for myself, but I don't do any shipping or anything. It's really more limited in people coming to come and visit and see our food forests and things on certain days that I'm open, and everything that I grow grows really well. So it's kind of a very sifted collection, and it's aronia berries, it's pawpaws, it's American elderberries. It's all these nuts we've mentioned, persimmons. All of these characters, which are easy to grow and very productive, which is what I always focus on. So aronia berries, there's red and black. And these are shrubs, very beautiful ornamental shrubs that can typically grow 6, 8, 10 feet tall. The black aronia, which is what I focus on because that's a really productive berry. That's very medicinal as well. Very easy to harvest and a very tough plant. All great factors. The deer do seem to like to eat the plant itself, so I have to kind of individually fence them to get them established. But it's got a terrible common name called chokeberry, not to be confused with choke cherry, which is a different tree species. So the chokeberry, the black aronia, is a producer of sort of very large looking blueberries. They're very dark purple black, the size of a large, and it kind of looks like blueberries. And they hang in these clusters, these big drupes that are really easy to harvest, which is a big boon because harvesting is not easy work. It gets romanticized a lot, but harvesting is quite a thing. So a plant that harvests easily has a lot of value. And it harvests in August, which is wonderful too, because you're not so busy with so many other types of seasonal work. So going out there and getting the aronia berries, you just pull off a whole cluster at once, like milking a cow. It's like they all fall off, and the birds don't hit them right away. Like if they go into the winter, the birds will start eating them, but they won't eat them right away, which is another big plus.
Huge plus.
Huge plus, right? So there's a lot of pluses, and they're very tough. They'll take dry, they'll take wet, they'll take salt spray. And they're very ornamental. Sometimes you can plant them in a nice long hedge, or what you might call a fedge, a fruiting hedge. Beautiful fall color. I'm just a big fan of them. But again, so there's a lot of wild ones, and you're going to get small berries, still good. Or you could go with something that's been more cultivated. And what I recommend is the cultivar Viking. So Viking, if you look it up, I think organic aronia berry. If you Google that, you'll come up with these guys out in the Midwest who have started a whole, business around selling their plants and the fruit. But you can get relatively inexpensive Viking, aronia plants from them. And then the aronia berry, you don't want to eat it fresh out of hand. That's where it gets its name, chokeberry. It's quite astringent. But when you steam or cook it down like you would elderberries, it takes on this beautiful, deep, rich, sort of old world berry flavor that makes great jams. It's great syrups. It makes great additive to wine making, meads. It's very popular in the cider world because it adds like a nice tannic finish to a hard cider. And then it's super medicinal. It's one of the most medicinal berries on the planet. So it's just one of these win-win-win.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's been good talking to you. I think that's a good point to wrap it up here as we're approaching on the hour. But before we go, Michael, I want to ask you to just tell everybody where they can find you and any resources if they want to get in touch with you or anything like that, and even your books one more time so they can try and find those books and just learn so much more from a wonderful resource.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So my landing website is Ecologia Design. Ecologia is a Portuguese word for ecology. So ecologiadesign.com is a wonderful landing spot for all the things that I've talked about and a lot more. We didn't even talk about natural burial, which is another thing that that's part of the full circle in everything that I'm working with and seeing that often gets left out in discussions and land use and just, how we hold each other in transition. But, on my website, you'll find a lot and links to my books there. And you can read more about the books. And there's a lot of how-to in my website as well. So there's quite a good information about growing, mushrooms, we didn't talk about really shaping your landscape to harvest water passively, working with swales on contour, keyline design. So that's a great spot for everything. I've got other podcasts I've recorded. And I'm always eager to talk to others. And I've recently kind of had this small aha moment where I'm like, I need to interact more with the hunting community, because they're the ones that are already planting a lot of nut trees and persimmons, and they're already moving in that direction. And I feel like what I have to add as far as, understanding, some of the genetic opportunities, or even just some for the patterning, how would you do an agroforestry system on an existing cornfield or hayfield? What does that look like? Those are things that I'm drafting and designing and working with a lot now. And that's where my focus and interest is going versus, sort of smaller residential edible landscaping, which is a lot of what I was doing. Really moving into these larger nut rich systems. So I'm eager to have more conversations with with audiences around this. So I'll just throw that out there for other people who have podcasts or audiences. I'm willing to share in this direction. And then on Instagram at permaculture ninja. That's probably where I do some of my more posting about kind of what I'm up to. That said, I'm going to take a sabbatical from email, from social media. I'm going to get a flip top phone for about 6 weeks. I think starting around December 20th till about February 1st, I'm going offline. But aside from that, those are ways and places that you can connect with me.
Wonderful. I appreciate it so much, and I think we're definitely going to have you back on and actually talk about. I guess we never even got to it really about the planting of the I don't even know what you called it, the nut rich agroforest for
the agroforestry. Yeah, actually, I'm looking. Yeah. Well, I know. I was just this morning, right before our talk, designing these systems where you could do chestnut, pecan, walnut, and you would interplant with black locust, pawpaw, aronia. You could do either low intensity or high intensity. I'm actually going to see if I can get these drafted and probably put up on my website so that there'll be some general understanding around it. But that's definitely something I would be happy to go into more detail on, because that's the practical side. It's like, well, how do I do this? Yeah, great ideas, but how do I do it? What are the straightforward ways to begin or to conceptualize how this would happen? And I've done a number of transitions of corn and pasture and hay fields into these systems. So I'm happy to share that how to. Whatever it takes to really get this happening is where I want to put myself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I appreciate it. And thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.